Good day, everyone. I am Adam Dean, and you're listening to An Attempt to Understand. Thank you very much for joining me again today. It's always nice to have you back. So, today, my friends, we are jumping into an overview of one of my favourite shows, and recently it has become one of my favourite books. We are jumping into the story of the golden age of stand-up comedy. It's called I'm Dying Up Here, Heartbreak and High Times in Stand-Up Comedy's Golden Era. And it was, like I said, it was made into a television series called I'm Dying Up Here, and it ran for 2 seasons. The notable stars, off the top of my head, Sebastian Stan is in the pilot. I forget your man's wee name. How unfortunate is that? If anyone knows the Bad Friends podcast with... No, I've forgotten the other guy's name. Oh, that's really poor timing. Yeah, with Bobby Lee, and he has his friend Andrew Santano or something like that. He's in it as well. So, really, what I'm Dying Up Here is about the struggle to get comedians paid through the 1970s. So it mainly follows a couple really huge stars that we would all know the names of now, like Robin Williams and Jay Leno and David Letterman and Richard Lewis. And it follows kind of these megastars as well as everybody else as they are fighting for compensation, essentially. You know, back in the day, comedians really weren't paid for their performances. Now, if you went on tour and you were touring around a bunch of different comedy clubs booked by your talent agent or your tour agent, then you would be getting paid for that, you know, because you're kind of bringing material to a place, you have a tight set, and it's committed. And then obviously, you know, back before social media and everything, stand-up was really a vehicle to get onto TV or into a movie. So you had these people that would sidestep out of comedy into these more entertainment-like traditional careers. But in terms of making it as like the day-to-day just struggle on your talents as a comedian, it was very, very difficult. People would not pay you to perform as like a regular in a comedy club. So the main club that the story focuses on, although it does at the start go from New York and kind of bounces over to LA, the main store in LA that it focuses on is called the Comedy Store. And the Comedy Store is ran by a woman called Mitzi Shore, who took it over from her husband when he had to go and do some shows. And then when he came back, he realised, oh, I'm not getting her out of this place. And he was right. She left him and took the club and dove into it. So, really, what impacts me, you know, and why I connect with the material so well. And I originally found it through the TV show and then went on and was gifted the book and found it very, very insightful, is that it's a fight for the justice of art. You know, it is grabbing at your own worth and saying that this is worth something. Standing up to people who are making profit off of you and saying that this isn't right. You know, because these comedians were starving. Like, they had, you know, just pennies and nickels, seeing what they could steal at the local diner counters, you know, that was left behind before the waitress would come and get it. And everyone kind of had this mindset at the time, and it's very close to what you see with the debate around student loans, where you have people in a boomer type generation say, oh, well, I had to work my ass off to pay this off, so you should have to work your ass off to pay it off, instead of seeing that there's like a definite injustice that could be rectified, you know? So it feels similar to that in the couple of comedians that were making it and were getting money from tours and stuff like that, really held in their heart this whole, well, I had to be an electrician part-time for 15 years, so yeah, you should have to do A, B, and C on the side. And really, it came up to a point, and it was interesting that this is a bit of a difference between the show and the book, is In the book and real life, the people that pushed for the strike really had quite a lot of success under their belt. You know, like you're talking about Robin Williams, who was parading around when Mork and Mindy came out. Obviously, Mork and Mindy is a little before my time, but it was extremely successful. Robin Williams depicts an alien on that show, and they describe in the book that he was the only one that actually came in and auditioned as an alien. You know, everyone else was putting a put on, you know, but Robin Williams came in and he just was an alien. So those like mega talents like him were successful. He was a millionaire, you know, he was up doing coke every night with Mitzi Shore in her mansion, and they were having a great time with it. But it was a lot of those people that sat there, and it's one particular night it took like Jay Leno and David Letterman and Elaine Boozler it took like five of the big people to like absolutely pack out the Comedy Store and do a sellout show, you know, and they were making like no money from doing that. The culture at the time, or what was being put on to the comedians, was the idea that your time in the comedy club, the work that you put in at open mics, and eventually leads to regular spots in like the small room and then regular spots in the big room, that was all like a university, a college, and you don't get paid to go to college, you know, which now is actually not true. For obviously people get scholarships or whatever, but athletes finally are getting paid, you know, properly, which is fantastic, because again, that's another system that used these people for their talent and profit and just threw them to the side. So it's really good that the student athletes are now being paid. But to get back to the larger point, you know, it was perceived at the time as that was the regular ladder of it. Like, you pay your dues, like how you pay your dues in the entertainment industry, and then eventually you're able to move on. And if you're good enough and you're lucky enough, you get a little bit of success and you start to play like the Playboy Club tour and stuff like that. So really what it came down to was that the people didn't want to see their fellow comedians continue to struggle. Even the ones that did find success did not forget the days where they were like stealing Twinkies to survive, you know. And the group of people at that time said, we need to make a difference. We need to stand for something, and we need to actually like help the people that are going to come after us, you know. And there's really two main people that I would want to speak about. And the first one I've mentioned already, which was Elaine Boozler. And Elaine, she was really looked at again as a top dog comedian at this time. In about May of 1979, there was an article in the LA Times titled, it was like the four like hot comics coming out of the LA comedy club scene. And it was like Elaine Boozler and Jay Leno and David Letterman, and Richard Lewis. So she was really looked at as, you know, top of the talent, okay? And at this time, like I said, the stand-up was really looked at as a measure of a speed run to an entertainment career. And how you got to that entertainment career really was you got onto the Tonight Show, okay? You got onto the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson essentially made or broke what you were gonna be. And Johnny Carson did not like Elaine Boozler. He thought that her jokes were too aggressive. He thought that you know, women at that time generally in comedy were too aggressive. He didn't like the tone that they were coming out with and the voice, and I guess it was too fiercely independent for him. Because of that, you know, he wouldn't put her on the show. Never mind invite her onto the couch, which was like the badge of honor that you had really made it. So the biggest ladder, like the biggest door that opens for your career, what everyone shoots for, she wasn't going to be able to get, you know. So she really needed the connections and the money and the networking opportunities. You know, she needed that so much more than really the other people did. The other people, even if they were told, you know, your material's not the great, or yeah, Johnny doesn't really like, you know, your style at the minute, at least you still have a technical possibility of improving that. You know what I mean? It's not that he doesn't like you as like an individual. If you completely come out and change yourself, then it would be undeniable. But that the same thing wasn't going for Elaine Boozler. You know, she really sacrificed like everything that all of the opportunity that she could have had, she sacrificed for picket lines to make a difference for her fellow comedians. Excuse me. Next, and the second person I want to speak about is Steve Lebukin. Steve Lebukin is someone that I obviously never knew, but I never had heard of either. He was best friends with Richard Lewis when they both went to New York to really start out like properly in the comedy scene together. And they kind of became, you know, like blood brothers type stuff, where they both agreed who they would help each other. You know, whoever made it would give the other one a helping hand up. And it's just so sad because Steve Lebukin, he faced multiple setbacks in his career. You know, he was told that his material wasn't right and that he wasn't hitting what he needed to hit to be invited onto the Tonight Show. That really put him back. He, because of that, kind of decided to pivot and try to do like a movie, like a comedy movie, be a director. And he ended up getting funding. Like, he got some money from his family, and he was able to actually make a film. But it then died in the distribution phase, you know, which was a further setback for him. By the time Richard Lewis, his best friend, did find his own success and was trying to put Steve into a film that he was working on, the studio cut the scene before they shot. And again, Steve kind of tried to roll it off in conversation, but really it was a continuous amount of setbacks for him. And by the time the strike happened, Steve was scared. You know, he was picketing with the rest of the people, but he was speaking to the kind of unofficial strike leader, Tom Dresden, another comedian. And he was speaking to him about his fear that essentially Mitzi was going to blackball comedians, especially the smaller comedians that picketed her comedy store, even after they resolve it, even after they come to a new agreement and they sign contracts for her to give regular payments to people for going up, which she was so like adamantly against. You know, it was never about the money. You kind of see that in the show, and you see that in the book a couple different times when they go to her with like really logically sound plans. You know, there's a great scene where, again, I think it's the Anthony Satano guy. He goes and speaks to Mitzi, and he's like, all we need to do is charge an extra $1 on the door for every customer, and then we split that extra $1 with the comedians. And she just shuts him down in such a brutal way. You know, she really makes him understand that it's not about the money. It's not about sharing money, or it's not about her losing profits. It's simply about the control that she exerts over these talented people and the resource that she is able to fully gather. It's like some Dune stuff, honestly. But it was brutal, you know. And just as a side point to give more reasoning for Steve being concerned about being blackballed, you know, Mitzi was like a ruthless businesswoman. She would send comedians with flyers for her club to the opening of other comedy clubs to like promote their deals and offers. She would ensure that none of the talent that were performing at her comedy store, which she invested in and grew to be like a mecca of comedy, she made them all agree to not play at any other comedy clubs like local to her at all. So if you wanted to do other shows, if you wanted to get paid for going up, you would need to go like way out from where she was in LA. So, you know, Steve was really concerned about this, and he said to Tom Dresden, and Tom, he heard the concerns, and he just kind of reassured him. He's like, look, we're putting into the contract, you know, we've got a lawyer and all, we're putting into the contract that she can't blackball anyone. Like, it's not going to happen. But Steve was still really concerned. So Tom agreed that he wouldn't return to the comedy store before Steve did. And he then, you know, Steve was kind of satisfied with that. And he was like, great, because he had to go and get on a plane and go to Vegas for a bunch of shows that he had booked. Now that the strike was finally done, because the strike took like manpower to organize. You know, you're thinking before you would just message someone on your phone, or you make a group chat with 50 people and schedule stuff, or you use like Notion as a scheduling software. Before any of that, they were sitting around just phoning people up on the old manual phone, writing down like, all right, when are you free? Can you come 3 a.m. on Tuesday? Nah, I'm busy then. I can do 7 a.m. Okay, 7 a.m.'s good. And it's like the logistics of planning the strike is actually much more monotonous than you would think. But eventually, like I said, Steve kind of takes Tom's word on it, and he goes forward. But then, unfortunately, days after the strike ends and they agree to sign a contract, Mitzi turns around and puts the proof in the pudding that she is blackballing people. She blackballs several different comedians. None of the big names that she was personal friends with, like Leno and Williams, they could just return whenever they wanted to. And none of them, just to stand a point, none of them actually stood in the line, like with the picket line and everything, and with the sign and all that stuff. They all just like supported the strike, but from a distance, from their mansions, you know what I mean? And again, I just think that really shows the character of Elaine Boozler. She was standing there with a sign in hand. She was giving up the opportunity, giving up the networking, giving that all up. I mean, Mitzi at the time was opening like a women's only store, or a women's only room, like within the Comedy Store. So she could have went in there, used that as leverage to be like headlining that thing every single night, but she didn't. So anyway, like I said, as the strike ended and Steve was blackballed, and that was kind of the final thing for him. That was kind of the final straw for him. And what then happened? What then happened was really sad, dear listener. It was really sad indeed, unfortunately. Steve LeBuchan, he walked down to the Comedy Store, and he bumped into his friend, and his friend said he was looking real poor, and he was like, yeah, but I'm just nipping down here and I'll be right back. And Steve then went down, and he went up the High Continental House, the store, or the place beside the Comedy Store, and he went up about 14 floors, and then he didn't want to tell jokes anymore, so he didn't. He took the quick way down from 14 floors, and he left a note for his friends and his family. The note called for fairness within comedy, and fairness within entertainment, and fairness within life. And his last words spoke about not taking revenge, but encompassing love. And, I really miss Steve LeBuchan. Like, I didn't know Steve LeBuchan. He literally died and was buried in New York 20 years before I was born. But in reading the stories about him, in reading how he affected people, and in reading how the end of his life was kind of encapsulated within this very prominent point of the history of comedy and performance and justice for art, it just really resonated with me. So yeah, honestly, to tell you the end, like, if you're still listening here after like 20 odd minutes, pretty much, thank you very much. To say how it properly ended in terms of everything. So, like I said, Elaine starts blackballing, or not Elaine, apologies. Mitzi starts blackballing people left, right, and centre, right? None of like the big names, but she starts blackballing comedians that like she personally has vendettas against for betraying her in the strike. Obviously, they then sue her. So the comedians form like Comedians for Compensation, and then they change the name of that into a more officially sounding union type name. And they end up suing her for breach of contract, and then she countersues them, because that's what you do. And unfortunately, after like 2 months of nothing going anywhere, the comedians had to join an official union that like already existed in order to have the right representation to go forward within the legal system. It was then decided by a judge that they didn't actually have the right to be within like the proper entertainment union that represents like actors and performers and that type of thing, and instead they technically fall under the nightclub workers union, which is very much described in the book as being a bit of a bit of a waste management type situation, a bit of a hey, Dad, are you mobbed up? Hey, that's a stereotype. So it's kind of portrayed to be a bit like that, to be honest. You know, the comedians had an opportunity earlier to join with the nightclub people, and they were like, no, these are all a bunch of seedy gits. But they ended up having to join with them because they were going through like the proper legal proceedings. That then dragged on for like 2 years, where the nightclub union essentially did nothing for the comedians except take their money. Eventually it concluded with some level of justice. Eventually they were able to get Mitzi to agree to pay for every set. Originally she was meant to pay like $15 per set, except for open mics, but that got reduced down. So it wasn't as much as like $15, unfortunately. And obviously the open mics were still unpaid to keep this level of openness, you know, to keep the bar low for people to get up on stage. But eventually they did get something set in stone, you know, and there were much more prominent kind of legs of this that started. When they formed the CFC, they were able to start making like deals with other clubs, so that other clubs would only work with comedians represented by the CFC, you know, so they're starting to like build new networks and kind of an independent infrastructure separate from the Comedy Store, which was really great. But ultimately, you know, it took a lot longer than unfortunately they wanted. Like I said, it was about 6 or 7 weeks, the actual strike itself, until she initially agreed to the $15, and then immediately went back on the contract, got caught up for like years in litigation until eventually they were able to settle it, you know, and there was like a standard set finally for people being paid. Yeah, you know, that's really the main thing I wanted to say. Again, if you've made it this far, I'll give you one fun bonus fact. It is heavily implied that there is a like competitor store, and that competitor was like kind of open to making deals with the comedians. And there was a meeting that Mitzi had with people, and someone shouted from the back of the meeting, like, well, what if he just wasn't there? Like, if he wasn't your competitor and he wasn't giving them options, then they would only have you. And I think within about 2.5 weeks, that guy's house burned down, or that guy's comedy club, burned down. And so it's kind of heavily implied that Mitzi had something to do with, you know, a poor struggling comedian stuffing a rag into some Jack Daniels and lighting your man's club on fire, which is wild and also happens in the TV show. Yeah, look, I'll wrap up by talking about the TV show, because I've obviously spoke very highly of the book, and I would definitely recommend the book. It is written by a journalist from the LA Times who was there at the time. There's a collection of photos in the center of the book that he actually took himself, or he took most of them himself. So it really is like a first-hand portrayal of who these people were, and this kind of snapshot of history of this, like I said, standing up for injustice against art, which is just so powerful. But yes, look, I'll finish by talking about the show. The show is really good. It also has, it was produced by Jim Carrey, which is funny. It's on Paramount Plus, I'm pretty sure, if anyone wants to actually check it out. Now, look, I will say there's 2 seasons of it, and it does end on a cliffhanger. Like, it got cancelled because the ratings weren't what they needed to be, and it's like a period piece because it's set in the 70s in LA, so it's extremely expensive to produce. So like, it's 2 seasons, and it does end on a cliffhanger. Now, I've rewatched the show maybe 3 or 4 times at this point, and you can kind of take a different ending away from the cliffhanger now that you know there's no more that's going to happen. You know, you can kind of take a different message away and look at the story under a different light. But the TV show overall is really fantastic. It shows like the impoverished pursuit of artists, and it shows the complicated lives that people end up leading when they don't really have a traditional structure of like a 9 to 5 or something like that, you know, where your whole life revolves around staying up to 2 in the morning for like a 5 minutes to make drunk people laugh in hopes of growing that to something greater. You know, there's a character called Cassie who is like a country girl from Wink, Texas, and her whole thing is really trying to like find her voice within comedy, and she holds a lot of guilt. Her character got like pregnant as a teenager and then had her sister take that child in because she wanted to come and pursue these dreams of being, you know, a famous entertainer. And Cassie's like parents passed away in a car accident when she was a kid, which is quite heavy, so apologies if that's a bit triggering for you. But she really works that in to her comedy. Like, you see the first time she brings it up, like the room goes absolutely silent and she has an audience member like apologize to her at the end. And then after like 3 or 4 more episodes of that working on in the background, you see her do a set and she brings up her parents, but she absolutely kills. Everyone's like laughing, you know, and she ends up turning it, instead of it being some jokes about how morbid it was that her parents died, she ends up talking about hearing like her mother's voice in her head judging her when she's like hooking up with a guy for the first time, you know, and she's like goes into all the details of it. And it is funny. It is funny. So it's a really, you know, it's a powerful story about standing up for art and justice, but it also speaks to expressing yourself and chasing what you want in life, and, you know, standing up to the business beliefs around that. Right, so look, that's been a bit of a ramble. If you want something more collected and a little more thought out about I'm Dying Up Here, and you don't want to read the book, you could read my thoughts on the book, which will take about 15 minutes. They are on the An Attempt to Understand Substack page. And yeah, I hope you check it out. I hope you have a good time. You know, it's a really fantastic book, really great show. I would recommend it if you have the time, or if you're into period dramas or, you know, media about stand-up in any type of way. I would definitely recommend it. Yeah, so that is pretty much all we have for this week, folks. Just under half an hour there. So again, if you have stuck with me the whole time, you know, that's a massive time commitment to give. That's more than an episode of The Simpsons. And like, what, 3 dozen people or something work on an episode of The Simpsons. So thank you very much. You know, your time is the most precious thing you have, and I really appreciate you spending it with me. And hopefully you've enjoyed, you've learned something, or you've took something away from it. Yeah, look, thank you once more. We'll go ahead and wrap up, but I'll see you next week on An Attempt to Understand with me, Adam Dean. All right, thank you so much then. Bye-bye.